Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We take complex topics, a stack of sources, and we really try to help you pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge.
That's the goal.
Today, we're embarking on, well, a really crucial journey. A deep dive into Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. It's a pivotal work.
Absolutely pivotal.
Our mission today is basically to unpack how centuries of interaction, we're talking slave trade, colonialism, how they didn't just reshape Africa, but also, profoundly influence Europe itself. So let's dig in.
Yeah, and it's important to remember this isn't just history for history's sake. It's this incredibly researched analysis. It really challenges the assumptions many of us hold.
Right.
And it gives us a framework, really, for looking at global inequality, stuff we still see today. Walter Rodney, amazing figure. Guyanese historian, scholar, activist.
And tragically killed so young.
They're just 38 in 1980. But his work, it continues to be so influential. It pushes people towards anti-racist activism, towards thinking critically about the structures, shaping our world.
Okay, so let's start there. When Rodney talks about underdevelopment, particularly concerning Africa, what's he actually getting at? Is it just like being economically behind?
Well, that's the first big point he makes. It's more than just being behind. He argues contemporary underdevelopment, as he calls it, isn't some natural state. It's not just a lack of development. It's an active process. It's the result of exploitation. Specifically, one country or region exploiting another. He says African and Asian societies, they were developing on their own paths.
Right, independently.
Exactly, until capitalist powers stepped in. And then they intensified the exploitation, basically draining away the surplus.
Surplus meaning of what exactly?
The extra wealth they generated, beyond what was needed just to survive and reinvest a bit, that got siphoned off.
And the evidence he uses, the numbers alone are pretty jarring, aren't they?
Oh, completely. The quantitative gap is massive. He points to, 1965, Africa's average income per person was about $140. Compare that to the U.S. in 68, over $3,500. And crucially, this gap wasn't closing. It was actually getting wider.
So the process was ongoing.
Yes. And it's not just money. Look at basic services. Cameroon, for instance, 100 out of 1,000 kids didn't make it to their first birthday. In the UK, just 12.
That's a huge difference.
Or doctors. Niger, one doctor for, over 56,000 people. Italy, one for every 580.
So quantitatively, huge gaps. What about qualitatively?
Right. Qualitatively, these underdeveloped economies, they don't really focus on the sectors that drive growth, like heavy industry. Instead, any savings often get sent abroad.
Or spent on luxury.
Or spent on luxuries by a small elite, yeah. It leads to these weird situations, Rodney noted, where administration bureaucracy ends up being the main industry, not actually producing things.
It's that paradox, isn't it? Places loaded with natural resources stay poor, while others with less thrive.
Exactly that paradox. And Rodney is very clear. Forget any God-given reasons for this. He says it's historical. It's about this exploitative relationship. African economies basically became satellites.
Orbiting the metropolitan powers, as he puts it.
Orbiting the metropolitan capitalist powers, feeding their centers.
Okay, this really sets the stage.
Yeah.
But it leads to a crucial point. What was Africa like before this intensive European contact really ramped up? Say, up to the 15th century. There are so many myths.
So many. And Rodney tackles them head on. He really challenges that whole idea of Africa as some kind of blank slate waiting for Europe.
Right.
He quotes J.E. Casely Hayford, writing back in 1922, saying, essentially, look, before the British even showed up, we were developed. We had our own institutions, our own ways of governing.
And Rodney uses the term cultures rather than civilizations, right? Why is that?
Yeah, he prefers culture, like the whole way of life, precisely to avoid those loaded, often prejudiced comparisons that come with the word civilization.
Yeah.
He talks about communalism being dominant.
Communalism, like shared ownership.
Pretty much. Land owned communally, society built around family, kinship ties. And he points out this isn't uniquely African. It's a stage all human societies went through at some point.
What's really striking, though, is the level of development already present. Rodney shows it wasn't uniform, obviously, but it was definitely happening. Egypt, for example.
Oh, absolutely. Egypt, 25 centuries ago, hugely capable of producing wealth. Why? Because they had the science, the technology. Meanwhile, folks in the British Isles, well, let's just say they were at a much earlier stage. Different tools, different social organization.
So development was happening internally.
Definitely. Maybe African agriculture wasn't pushed in exactly the same ways as in parts of Asia or Europe, different pressures and all that. But there was internal evolution. You see classes starting to form. You see that shift from communalism towards something more like feudalism in lots of places.
Can you give me some examples he uses?
Sure. He points to places like Egypt and Ethiopia. They had developed feudal states, clear class divisions, peasants, the felon in Egypt being exploited, a literate culture tied to religion and the state, very sophisticated. Or the Western Sudanic empires, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, huge political zones thriving on that trans-Saharan gold trade. Maybe not perfectly feudal like Europe, but complex, organized societies.
All right.
Then there's the interlacustrine zone. Think Bunyoro, Katara, Buganda, Rwanda. Power there often revolved around cattle ownership. That created hierarchies, boosted production, but often through, well, more exploitation, like the Batutsi ruling over the Bahutu in Rwanda.
And later examples, too, like the Zulu.
Yeah, the Zulu kingdom in the 19th century. Shaka Zulu, he revolutionized their military, their political systems. European observers were, frankly, impressed by the discipline, the order.
And Rodney makes a key point about Shaka, doesn't he?
He does. He says Shaka's genius could only emerge because he was in a self-governing society. He was free to develop his potential. Imagine him born a slave in America, totally different outcome.
That's powerful. And Benin, too.
Yeah.
Europeans visited, right?
They did. And described it as this very great town, wide streets, straight streets, a palace reportedly bigger than the city of Amsterdam at the time. And the people were noted for their cleanliness, compared even to the Dutch.
So the picture by the 15th century is diverse, evolving societies across the continent. Europe had maybe a slight edge in a couple of areas.
Yeah, slight edge. Mostly in things like shipping those ocean-going vessels and the beginnings of that dynamic capitalist energy, but it was slight.
But that slight edge, as you say, it transformed everything pretty quickly. How did Europe manage to leverage that? And what was Africa's sort of unwitting role in boosting Europe's early capitalism, even before full-blown colonialism?
Well, you have to see it as part of building a global system, right? Malachy Postlethwaite said it bluntly in 1745. British trade is this magnificent superstructure built on an African foundation.
Wow.
And Marx, noted that the dawn of capitalist production was marked by the hunting of black skins. Europe's advantage wasn't across the board technologically, but it was decisive in key things, those ships and cannons.
Which leads us straight to the slave trade.
Directly. European goods, guns, textiles, alcohol became really sought after by some African rulers.
So they were drawn in.
Drawn in, yeah. And this led to wars being fought specifically to capture people to sell. It became this vicious, destructive cycle. And Africa's political fragmentation in certain areas like Guinea-Bissau made it, as Rodney puts it, a slave trader's paradise.
And he's clear, isn't he? It wasn't African sins driving this, but European capitalism setting it in motion.
Absolutely. He puts the primary responsibility squarely on European capitalism demanding that labor. The consequences for Africa, just devastating. And Rodney connects the dots brilliantly. It wasn't just one bad thing. It was a system de-developing Africa.
Let's break those consequences down. Population loss is the obvious one.
Huge. Millions upon millions of young, able-bodied people ripped out over centuries. It led to population stagnation, which is unique compared to other continents during that time. And we should remember the so-called Arab slave trade on the East Coast. A lot of that also fed European-owned plantations, like on islands in the Indian Ocean.
Okay, so population. What else? Economic impacts.
Massive economic disruption. Think about the insecurity it created. A huge shift away from productive things like farming or gold mining towards just raiding for captives.
That must have undermined everything else.
Totally. Agriculture declined in many places. He points to famines in areas like Dahomey linked directly to this shift. And then there's technological stagnation.
How so? Europe was booming, right?
Exactly. Europe reinvested the profits from the slave trade into its own industrial revolution. But Africa's own craft industries, they stagnated or were even destroyed. The terms of trade were terrible. You'd trade so much raw material or even people for relatively few manufactured goods.
So no real technology transfer.
Not in a meaningful way, because the African economies weren't structured to actually use that technology productively for their own benefit. Plus, existing trade routes within Africa were deliberately broken down or discouraged.
Why?
To tie each region directly to European ports and markets. Divide and conquer, essentially, make them dependent.
And all this required an ideology to justify it.
Which is where racism comes in, institutionalized as an ideology. Rodney really highlights the sheer hypocrisy of it all. Europe talking about democracy, Christian values.
While engaging in mass enslavement.
Precisely. It needed racism to square that circle, to dehumanize Africans and justify the brutality.
Okay, so the slave trade lays this brutal groundwork. Then comes formal colonialism. You describe the trade as the hammer. Colonialism is the vice.
That's a good way to put it. Colonialism clamped down, it formalized, it intensified the extraction. Rodney argues its central purpose, its whole reason for being, was the massive export of surplus value from Africa.
And how was that achieved?
Yeah.
Labor must have been key.
Labor was incredibly cheap. Wages were often deliberately set below subsistence levels.
Below survival. How does that work?
It forced workers to also grow their own food on the side or rely on family back in the village. It subsidized the low wages. Plus, there was outright legal coercion, forced labor for public works, building railways, roads.
Which weren't for African benefit, were they?
Not primarily, no. They were built to get raw materials out more efficiently. To the ports, then to Europe. This was pure exploitation. It wasn't some kind of developmental gift.
And we see this across different sectors. Mining, for example.
Oh, absolutely. Mining is a classic case. Think of the Congo under King Leopold II, then the Belgian state. Unbelievable wealth extracted from rubber, then minerals, often using horrific violence.
In Liberia, that wasn't a formal colony, but
it became a virtual colony of the U.S., yeah. Firestone Rubber got 1 million acres of land. 1 million acres for 6 cents an acre. The profits they made were astronomical.
What about trading companies?
The big European firms like UAC United Africa Company or the French CFAO, they formed cartels, basically, called pools.
To do what?
To fix prices. They'd agree to pay low prices for the crops African peasants produce, like cocoa or groundnuts. And at the same time, they'd charge high prices for the imported goods Africans needed to buy.
A double squeeze.
A double squeeze, exactly. Financial institutions, too, banks, insurance companies, they funneled African wealth out. Colonial governments often made the colonies pay for their own administration, sometimes even forcing them to pay taxes for, say, Britain's military ventures elsewhere.
So even the administration was extractive.
And then you had things like the produce marketing boards.
Weren't they supposed to help farmers stabilize prices?
That was the official line. But in reality, Rodney shows they acted like giant siphons. They bought crops cheap from farmers, sold them high on the world market, and the huge profits. They often went straight into the British government's pockets or to private companies, not back to the farmers or into African development.
It's systematic. Beyond the pure economics, though, what were the social and political impacts? You mentioned Rodney's line about the colonized being removed from history.
Yeah, that's profound. African political structures, states, kingdoms overnight, they lost their power, their independence, their meaning. They became administrative units of a European empire.
And the impact on social structures, like on women?
Significant deterioration. As men were pulled into the cash economy mines, plantations, building railways, women were often left with more work back home. Farming, childcare, community support. But their traditional work was devalued because it wasn't generating cash for the colonial system.
And then there's the issue of tribalism. This is a really important point Rodney makes.
Crucial. He argues that what we often think of as ancient, ingrained tribal hatreds in Africa is largely a product of colonialism itself. How so? Well, colonial powers drew arbitrary administrative boundaries, often lumping different groups together or splitting existing ones. Then they often favored certain groups over others for jobs in the administration or the army or access to education.
Creating resentment and division.
Exactly. It institutionalized ethnic difference and competition for scarce colonial resources. It turned ethnicity into tribalism, a tool of control and a source of conflict that served colonial interests.
That's a powerful reframing. And the effects on just basic physical well-being and education.
Also very stark. Colonialism often led to worse nutrition, not better. The focus shifted to cash crops for export, sometimes displacing food crops. This led to chronic malnutrition, diseases like kwashiorkor.
That's the protein deficiency one, right? Causes swelling.
That's the one. Oxfam famously used images of children with kwashiorkor in their fundraising posters later on. But Rodney's point is the posters rarely connected it back to the system, the colonial system that actually created the conditions for that starvation.
And education. Was that a tool for upliftment?
Hardly. According to Rodney, it was mostly an instrument of underdevelopment. It wasn't designed to empower Africans for their own society's progress.
What was it for then?
It was designed to train a small, manageable elite. Just enough clerks, low-level administrators, interpreters to help run the colony and serve European companies. And crucially, it instilled European values, European perspectives, often teaching Africans to look down on their own cultures.
Creating a subservient class, essentially.
Pretty much. He uses the Belgian Congo again as an example. Huge country, over 13 million people at independence. How many university graduates? 16?
16.
16. It was a deliberate policy to limit higher education to prevent the emergence of a leadership class that could truly challenge Belgian rule.
Wow. Okay, so we've talked about the direct monetary extraction, but Rodney also points out something else, a kind of non-monetary contribution Africa made to Europe's rise. What does he mean by that?
Right, it's not just about the cash profits, though those were immense. He argues colonialism provided this indispensable link for Europe's own technological leap forward.
How did that work?
Well, the profits and the raw materials extracted from Africa and other colonies directly financed scientific research, innovation, industrial development back in Europe.
Can you give examples?
Think about it. The wealth-funded advancements in industrial machinery, new chemical processes. Shipping technology improved dramatically. Things like refrigerated ships were developed specifically to transport perishable goods like meat or fruit from the colonies over long distances.
Okay, I see.
Military technology, too. Building bigger, better naval vessels to control the empire. Even later on, the development of atomic weapons, the uranium for the Manhattan Project, came largely from the Belgian Congo.
So the resources and profits fueled the very engine of European technological and military dominance.
Exactly. The whole capitalist system became globally integrated, but the benefits, the development, it all flowed overwhelmingly towards and was concentrated within Europe and North America.
But amidst all this overwhelming system, Africans weren't just passive bystanders, were they? Rodney does talk about African agency resistance.
Absolutely not passive. It's crucial to remember that. There were always forms of resistance, adaptation, and even attempts at independent development against the grain, like Muhammad Ali in early 19th century Egypt.
What did he try to do?
He made a serious effort to industrialize Egypt, build factories, protect local industries with tariffs. This was directly counter to what European powers wanted, which was Egypt as a market for their goods and a source of raw cotton.
So they opposed him.
They did. Eventually, European pressure helped undermine his efforts. And even as colonialism took hold, Africans were, ironically, often recruited by the Europeans themselves.
As soldiers, administrators.
Yes, soldiers, police, low-level administrators, helping, in effect, to consolidate the very foreign rule that was oppressing them. Sometimes African rulers would seek alliances with Europeans against their local rivals.
Without realizing the bigger danger.
Perhaps. Rodney suggests they sometimes underestimated the total, all-encompassing nature of European imperial ambition. He calls it a partial and inadequate view of the world, which itself, he argues, was partly a consequence of Africa's relative underdevelopment compared to Europe at that point.
So the internal political divisions which existed before Europe became a fatal weakness Europe could exploit.
Precisely. Not a sign of inherent backwardness, but a vulnerability in the face of a new, aggressive global power. But, and this is key, that very system of exploitation also sowed the seeds of its own destruction.
How so?
Well, the shared experience of oppression, the contradictions of colonialism, like talking about freedom while denying it, all this, spurred new forms of resistance. New social forces emerged.
Like the educated elite you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. That small group educated in colonial schools, often exposed to European ideas of liberty, nationalism, equality. They turned those ideas back against the colonizers. They became leaders of nationalist movements.
And it wasn't just the intellectuals.
No. Students protested. Workers organized. African trade unions, even though colonial governments tried to control or co-opt them, often linked their demands for better wages and conditions to the bigger fight for political independence. Rodney emphasizes the push for independence came from the African people.
Despite European intentions to hold on.
Oh, yeah. The French, for example, were saying as late as 1948 that self-government in the colonies was something to be avoided. But the pressure from African movements, protests, strikes, political organizing, sometimes armed struggle just became too strong to contain.
So independence became inevitable.
It did, but Rodney calls it flag independence.
Meaning?
Meaning they got political sovereignty, their own flag, their own national anthem, their own politicians. But the underlying economic structures, the dependency, often remained. Still, it was a crucial first step, regaining sovereignty, the ability to start charting their own course.
This whole deep dive into Rodney, it really just lays bare how tangled up Europe's development was with Africa's underdevelopment. It wasn't coincidence, was it? It was a system.
A systematic process of exploitation. Deliberate, not accidental, not natural. That's his core argument.
Yeah.
And A.M. Babu, in his postscript to the book, really hammers this home. He says Rodney forces us to ask the really fundamental questions, to look into the past, to know the present.
And Babu challenges common ideas too, right? Like the vicious circle of poverty.
He dismisses it. He says that theory basically blames the victim. He argues, like Rodney, that foreign investment, which is often sold as the solution,
has historically been the cause of the problem.
Has historically often been the cause, or at least a major part of economic backwardness, entrenching that satellite status. Babu talks about the need for mental decolonization. We have to unlearn the ways of thinking imposed by that history to really grasp it.
Which leaves a big question for you, the listener, doesn't it? We're still living in a world with huge global inequality. Economic challenges persist across Africa. How do Rodney's insights challenge the way we think now about development, about foreign aid, about global trade?
Right. Does understanding this history, this dialectic, as Rodney might say, does it maybe push us towards different solutions, towards supporting more genuinely self-determined paths for progress?
Rodney's hope, Babu suggests, was that ordinary people, the masses, would read his work, understand these ideas,
and act on them to transform their own situations, challenge exploitation wherever they find it.
A powerful call to action. This deep dive was grounded in Walter Rodney's seminal work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, with insights also drawn from contributions by Angela Y. Davis and A.M. Babu in some editions. We really encourage you to seek out the book itself and engage with its arguments directly.
It's essential reading.
Until next time on The Deep Dive.